Hello and welcome to our latest AIB Journals webinar featuring the research published in the Journal of International Business Studies and the Journal of International Business Policy. My name is Klaus Meyer. I'll be your co-host today together with Helena Barnard from the University of Pretoria. Most of the participants probably already know how we do things in this forum. We select papers that have recently been published in one of our journals and which speak to a common overarching question. That question today is investment in developing countries and the informal institutions in those countries. How do foreign investors engage with that informal aspects of those countries? In terms of process, let me remind you, you have the opportunity to participate. We use the Q&A function to collect questions. You can also look at questions that other people have answered and sort of vote for questions. If you vote for questions, those questions move up in the priority list, and they're more likely to come to the attention of Helena, who is the co-moderator today. Just as a few words of introduction to the topic, developing countries, of course, are an interesting area within international business and have always been for a long time. One of the challenges in those countries is that they have a lot of informal rules, sort of traditional rules of how things are done in the country, which is quite different from what's the legal code. It may come from religion or other traditional codes. And for foreign investors, that represents a challenge in doing business. But it also means that foreign investors engaging in the country have an impact on this informal institutional environment. That's sort of at the core of today's papers that we've selected. And now let me, without further ado, hand over to Helena Barnard, who is professor at the Gordon Institute of Business Science at the University of Pretoria, South Africa. She's a specialist, especially on business in Africa, and expect a lot of questions related to Africa arising today, although we also have Myanmar, which is quite different ethnic graphically, but has some development challenges that are quite similar. Over to you, Helena.
Thank you so much, Klaus. Yeah, I think in terms of informal institutions, I think part of the success of your work also with Mike Ping is that we like, okay, this is interpersonal relationships, or maybe it's the rules of the games. And I really like the fact that we mention norms in the title. I think values matter. I think that what we learn from under-research context is exactly how rich is this concept. So we've got Myanmar, we've got mining multinationals in Africa, and then we've got specifically a focus on rural investment. So I'm really excited about the topics that we're going to be discussing today. I'd like to hand over to Tim Andrews from Chiang University with his co-authors Nimanand Tihitun and Santi Dirakul. I'm sure I'm bludgeoning it, Tim, but over to you. We would love to hear about your research. You're on mute, Tim. You unmuted yourself and then you remuted yourself.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so yeah, okay. I just want to get to the slideshow. So if I, hold on, let me just double click. Okay, there we are. Okay, so I'd like to begin by just saying thank you very much to Helena, and also to Klaus, of course, for inviting us to this. Is it possible to go back to the beginning slide?
That's up to your computer.
Wait a minute. Okay, let's if I click from the beginning, it should start on that slide. Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. Thanks again to Klaus for inviting us to present our work this evening. Obviously, superstition is an unusual topic. It's a sort of anti-science in a sense, in terms of theorizing and predicting organizational behavior. Nonetheless, however, it is hugely influential in its influence on day-by-day business decision-making and business strategy on the ground. Our own motivation for doing this paper wasn't from any established gap in the literature. We weren't looking for gaps per se, but it stemmed rather from experiences we had whilst engaged on consultancy assignments and other commercial projects in Myanmar, and then refined and deepened with our co-author Kintiton, who is born and bred Myanmar. As a context, Myanmar itself then was not really chosen as such by us, but I would say that nonetheless, it does present a fitting context as an extreme case. Superstition is everywhere, and it's important, I think, to just get that out of the way, but there is a wealth of literature that does point to it being particularly influential across East and Southeast, particularly emerging Asia. I'd finally like just to say that the paper itself is divided into two parts in a sense. The first of these deals with multinationals' response to superstitious practice initially, and then the rest of the paper looks at how this it unfolded over time, both the policy and the superstition itself. We're going to focus mostly on the first part today, in line with the focus of the seminar this evening. So first of all, I'd just like to preview briefly what exactly superstitious belief and managerial decision-making and its effects on those organizations in Myanmar at the time. According to our data, there were four main areas upon which it played a significant role. Among these included selection of employees, both at the senior manager level and way down below, as well as deselection and dismissing people in a kind of order. All of the four actually involved fortune tellers. The first of these, employee selection, involved signs and insights, for example, from astrology, anomancy, which is the interpretation of dreams, numerology, and clairvoyance. But that was a particularly important one for the multinational to actually try and deal with. Others on the list here, we have business negotiations. So that would include rituals that are undertaken by fortune tellers, for example, to weaken one's opposing number, as well as provide lots of insights into things like influencing the negotiation in terms of what you wear, the time you arrive at the meeting or before the meeting, where you sit in terms of north, northeast, south, southwest during the course of the meeting, and so forth. Business location choices, again, very important for a Western multinational when you're just entering markets such as Thailand, such as Myanmar rather, because that was based on fortune tellers looking for fortuitous locations, if possible. Where that was not possible, engaging in ceremonies to compensate for areas deemed as being perhaps unlucky. Finally, we have business blessings. And I mean, there's a host of different blessings, but in summary, some were all about neutralizing danger, and others were more to do with inducing good luck. It's important to say that all of these were considered, I mean, deep assumptions, legitimate, strongly held norms concerning how to make decisions among the Myanmar managers. So this obviously presented the multinationals going in there with a dilemma. And the dilemma, I think what's particularly important to say is it was not just about balancing the norms and values of the multinational with a particular host institution, but it was about balancing the norms inside with not one, but two institutions, because you also had the influence of not only superstition that you're dealing with and policy values, but also you had the influence of the formal religion as well. Formal Buddhism and superstition in Myanmar can be seen as two parts of a contested institutional dyad, you could call it, the spiritual practice system, for lack of a better term. So the multinational was trying to balance all three of those. And that's what made it particularly complex. It was important to be seen, obviously, as legitimate back home, but also with the formal religion, formal religious enforcers, and the superstitious practice that was very important for local managers. It's important to mention that from the perspective of the Theravada Buddhist enforcers, superstition was by and large not legitimate, whereas from the perspective of local managers, superstition was simply another way to extend the influence of what they took to be Buddhism in their everyday business practice. So this became very complicated. Taking this on board, the question for the multinational is, what should we do? I mean, the first question here, the initial question was, how should the multinational engage, respond to the use of superstition in the decision-making of its host subsidiary managers? It became a slightly wider question of looking at, well, how should it engage with this powerful informal institution when it's discouraged by its formal institution counterpart? It embodies a high degree of potentially negative multinational reputation impact, and it runs counter, of course, to the multinational's own core norms, values, and policies. So what did we find? We found that, importantly, multinationals responded in different ways, broadly speaking, according to a configuration of the following 4 determining factors. So it was very much a pragmatic trade-off of different elements, depending on the superstition and what it was actually being used for. These include, as you can see, assessing the potential risk for the corporate reputation, looking at the degree of adherence to corporate values, was that a big problem or not? Looking at whether it was weakly or strongly approved by the formal religious enforcers, and finally, and most importantly in a sense, looking at how strongly local managers themselves felt that this was essential in terms of local performance impact. We found that there were 5 different responses as a consequence of this. I don't have time to go into the details here, but we can have a look at some of them. I mean, broadly speaking, an outright rejection, a good example would be the use of superstitious practice for the selection of senior managers. That was rejected because it was seen as a large reputation risk. It didn't adhere to the values of the corporation, and it was prohibited by former religious enforcers, at which point they just said, no, we're not doing it. Full endorsement, the opposite situation, was where, I mean, an example would be the blessing of a new production facility where it was felt to be not of any significant risk assessment, and it was showing respect in effect for local customs in line with the policy of showing respect for local culture for those organizations concerned. Where you had a symbolic or ceremonial endorsing, it meant that there was a public display that you were okay with the ceremony or ritual or whatever it was being held, but it was felt to be weakly aligned with the values of the organization. One corporation, an example was of a cleansing ceremony. Things get slightly more interesting when we look at the final 2 responses. One we've called contingent endorsement, because it was a practice that had a high degree of formal approval among the religious enforcers. So it's important to be seen as adhering to that, but at the same time, it was felt to be quite a risky step in terms of reputation, and it had a weak link to the values of the organization concerned. So although it was endorsed, there was the contingency placed in which the multinational kind of quietly took measures behind the scenes to mitigate what it felt would be the potentially negative consequences. One example was dealing with a banyan tree held to be sacred in according to Theravada Buddhism, and a blessing ceremony to deal with it, but its roots were destabilizing a silo. So they took steps to deal with that tree, whilst at the same time making sure that was done without disrespecting the local formal enforcers. Another one was the use of electrocution rackets to kill flies in the kitchen of a hotel, which had to be dealt with delicately. It was felt to be un-Buddhist, but obviously there was a problem with insects ending up on people's foods. That was again taken care of behind the scenes. The final response that we identified that was actually very common was tacit acquiescence. And the key thing about tacit acquiescence, unlike all of the others, was the degree of importance attached to it by the local managers, a degree to which was felt to be worth offsetting against the other elements that were less favorable, in order to let it go ahead without actually endorsing it, but without actually stopping it. One example would be the recruiting of staff that were not senior managers, not to deem to be in key strategic positions, but rather those that were further on down below. I mean, it could be drivers, junior administrative staff, and it was felt that, look, we can just let this go, and that would probably be the best idea in this particular case. Another example was allowing a structure to be built outside of a factory by fortune tellers, etc., and that was to ward off the apparent negative effects of a statue that had been placed across the other side of the road of a cobra in front of a snake farm that was held to be responsible for unlucky production processes that had been hindering operations for the weeks preceding that. So yeah, just to give you a flavor of what the multinationals, actually Western multinationals, actually tried to do in terms of adaptation and navigation of a set of conditions that was actually exceedingly complex. Again, the important thing to note was this is a pragmatic trade-off of these different factors together. I think in terms briefly of future directions, there are future directions that I would like to see progress, both in terms of superstition and the framework of propositions we put together, and also in terms of informal norms more widely in emerging environments. If I can just very briefly say that, look, concerning transferability of the framework that we drew up, I think obviously we need to look at that in different contexts. We said that Myanmar was an extreme case, but nonetheless, you should be able to look at this in more murky environments because there is a framework with which to start off. The problem for a lot of Western multinationals going in is that they go in effectively blind, oblivious to some of the mechanics, but these are obviously very important decisions for the multinational: location, personnel recruitment. And so an awareness of these kinds of issues, I think is an important step forward. Concerning institutions more widely, I think that it would be beneficial to look at other informal institutions, and particularly, I think, longitudinal research, where you can look at how, say, in this case, it was superstition and multinational formal policy. But I think an interesting area to look at in the future would be how these things coexist and co-evolve over time, because there is actually very little out there about that. I mean, returning to the idea of the selection of senior managers, it's not only superstition, there's also the use of interpersonal networks that are extremely common, particularly across Asia, Guanxi's being the big example from China. But I think, mandated multinational corporate recruitment policy isn't going anywhere. I mean, that's still going to be mandated, no matter how long those companies are there, because it's key to the values. Interpersonal network norms or superstitions also not going anywhere either. So I think what would be interesting was to look at the interplay of those two things to see how they unfold together as a process over time. And that just about brings our presentation to a close. I think we're just slightly over time, but there you go. So I'll stop the screen share now. Okay.
Thank you very much, Tim. The next speaker is Charles Stevens with his co-author Aloysius Nuanam Kahindi. Charles is joining us from Lehigh, talking about mining multinationals in Africa. Charles, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be in Zoom world. My name is Charlie Stevens from Lehigh University, and it is a pleasure to be here to present my paper with Aloysius Nuanam Kahindi, who's at the University of Victoria in Canada. The paper is titled An Institutional Logics Approach to Liability of Foreignness, the Case of Mining MNEs in Sub-Saharan Africa. And this study was motivated by this paradox of sorts in the liability of foreignness literature within the IB research stream. which argues that many forms of liability of foreignness are either caused or made worse by differences in institutions, either informal institutions, as is the focus of today's webinar, or formal institutions that create friction for the foreign MNE. But then the strategy for overcoming this LOF in many cases is to first learn about the host country institutions and then engage in what Cantwell and all call institutional adaptation, engaging in isomorphic behaviors in order to gain legitimacy and overcome the frictions that are causing this liability of foreignness. However, especially over the last, I'd say, decade or two, there's been a growing body of work in IB that's kind of pushed back against the two steps of this institutional adaptation strategy. First, we have research that suggests that, especially when institutional differences are great, it's hard just even to learn and understand about the host country environment. MNEs aren't these kind of all-knowing, all-seeing supercomputers. I kind of like Tim's wording. I jotted it down where he said that the MNEs can be blind and oblivious, and that happens sometimes. That happens probably more often than we sometimes admit in the IB literature. And then second of all, the other side of this, or other part of this paradox, is that isomorphic behavior in many cases is either not possible or, for a variety of reasons, not desirable for multinationals when they go into a host country setting. Again, especially when you have some pretty large institutional differences between where the firm is coming from and where it's going. So the thrust of this paper was to really dig into this question of, okay, so how can firms overcome liability of foreignness by means other than isomorphic conformance to host country institutions? And we addressed this question by staying within the institutional theory framework, but using a different strain of it, specifically institutional logics. So the idea behind institutional logics is to really embrace this idea of institutional conflict and clash, and to understand how do actors navigate or influenced by and influence themselves institutions that they come into contact with that are in conflict with each other, and change them as needed. And so it takes a very different approach, to really emphasize institutional entrepreneurship rather than isomorphism. The challenge for us as IB researchers, though, is that a good portion of this literature was not done within an IB context. It assumes that the conflicting institutions are within the same geographic locale. And so an actor that is seeking to change them would already be embedded in these conflicting institutions. And yet, in the case of liability of foreignness, this is usually not the case. You have a multinational who is in a foreign country that is not embedded in that location and cannot make changes to it unilaterally. And on the flip side, you have host country stakeholders that are entering into conflict with this firm that aren't embedded in the firm itself or the firm's home country, which again makes it harder to do institutional entrepreneurship. And so kind of these unanswered questions pointed to the idea of doing more of an inductive approach to addressing our research question, which is precisely what we did. So to address the questions we were interested in, we undertook a qualitative study in East Africa, specifically the countries of Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, and examined the case of 8 Western mining firms that were undergoing pretty significant liability of foreignness. And my co-author, Aloysius, our team of research assistants from the area, conducted about 87 interviews, not just with the firms themselves, but also with local employees of these firms, with NGOs, with local stakeholders to really understand different perspectives on what was causing the liability of foreignness and what were these actors doing in order to overcome it. And in our context, we found significant liability of foreignness. And this took the form of protests, of strikes, of violence. Sometimes it could turn deadly because of large fundamental clashes between these mining firms and the local communities that they were investing in, which were primarily fairly remote rural areas, and in many cases had never had a large foreign presence on their land before. And firms tried a number of approaches to try and deal with this conflict. Isomorphism wasn't really an option given just how great the differences were across institutions. They tried kind of things from the typical CSR playbook. They tried building schools, planting trees. That didn't do the trick, and in some cases even exacerbated some of the conflict between the firms and the local environment. So what we found is that a couple of firms, specifically 2 firms out of the 8, started to undertake a different approach. And as they started to have success with it, we found that the other firms in our sample were imitating aspects of this strategy. And it was something that we hadn't really seen in the literature before. It involved the co-creation of new hybrid institutional logics. So it involved both the firm, the M&E, doing things that it hadn't done before that were different from the logics that it had used before. It involved different approaches, different understandings by the local community as well. And these kind of, it was almost a new playing field. The old ones just weren't working, and so they needed to kind of create this new one together. But as the institutional logics approach would suggest, neither side could unilaterally change the other. And in fact, it was kind of those attempts that would drive a lot of the friction in the past. And so we found a key role played by intermediaries, specifically the local employees that were working for the multinationals. So they had one foot in the context, the logics of the foreign M&E, and they had the other foot embedded in the local context where they came from, where they lived and were raised. And it, like I said, it involved a number of different changes. The multinationals began to understand and see the value and legitimacy of activities that were going on in the informal economy around them, and they even began to sponsor and support some of the aspects of the informal economy, which previously they viewed with suspicion. In the local context, there were changes to how previously under-enfranchised individuals, specifically women and younger people, were empowered both entrepreneurially and socially as well. They created, in many cases, a number of positive outcomes. Now, this wasn't a complete success story. We found of the 8, about 2 had lasting success by following this strategy. We found 2 firms of the 8 that, because of a little bit more heavy-handed and more unilateral approach to trying to make changes, also some inconsistencies at what headquarters was requesting of them, this ended up sliding back into instances of pretty intense conflict again. For the other 4 firms, they were kind of in the middle, where this strategy certainly improved things quite a bit, but there would still be flare-ups, and liability and foreignness didn't entirely go away, but it was much improved by taking this approach. The contributions that we believe this study makes, one is to really kind of try and shift the pendulum a little bit on institutional studies, especially in the liability of foreignness literature, that really emphasize the role of isomorphism and really change the conversation more to entrepreneurship and say, okay, institutions aren't static, and in many cases, MNEs can't or won't simply conform to them. So what other options are out there for them? But critically, again, to I think push back against the idea that firms and multinationals have complete agency on their own. They can't simply make changes, especially the institutions where they're not fully embedded themselves, which points to the role of intermediaries. In this case, in this study, the role played by local employees who were embedded in both sets of institutional contexts. Another contribution is to challenge the idea that liability of foreignness is either just kind of a one-time cost at entry, as Heimer thought of it, or that it is something that just kind of monotonically diminishes over time as firms simply learn about the host country context and adapt to it. Instead, institutional logic's perspective suggests that unless those conflicting logics, the fundamental conflict is dealt with, liability of foreignness won't go away, and in some cases it can even get worse. And this has broad implications beyond the LOF literature. So much of what IB looks at is understanding how do firms handle institutional complexity, how do they handle these differences between formal and informal institutions, the line between which gets blurred quite a bit, especially in developing countries. So for Aloysius and I, we've continued work along this theme in the area of political risk and corruption, but we believe this has implications in many other IB research streams as well. So with that, thank you very much, Asante Sana. That's thank you very much in Swahili. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about my paper a little bit with Aloysius, and I look forward to engaging more in the Q&A session as well. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. The next person that I'd like to invite is Kristin, whose paper, she's from the University of Victoria, if I'm correct. Elizabeth Moore, Camille Meyer, and Jonathan Doe are the co-authors, really looking at multinationals, the informal institutions of communities, and what it does to rural poverty. So Kristin, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Helena, and thank you so much, Klaus, for inviting us to give this talk. So as Helena already outlined, this is of course collaborative work with Elizabeth Moore from Northeastern University, Camille Meyer from the University of Cape Town, and Jonathan Doe from Villanova University. And we're kind of flipping the coin here with this paper. So we're not looking at external impact factor and institutional environments on multinational enterprises and their behavior in developing countries, but we're flipping it around and look at multinational enterprises' impact on the environment, on communities and community informal institutions. And so going really to the rural level here. So let me set the scene and why we wanted to study or why this paper existed. So in the early 21st century, the Ethiopian government started to sell and market millions of hectares of land to multinational enterprises. And of course, there were a lot of multinational enterprises to acquire this land and started to use it for their own agricultural businesses. They started to produce flour, palm oil, rice, and then exported these products to the world market. And one of these companies was Karatori, an Indian company, and they took over land in the Gambela region in Ethiopia. However, that land, which was previously used by local communities and the rural population in the area. And so now that the multinational enterprises acquired the land, the communities no longer could use the land for their own subsistence farming, for their religious and cultural activities. So they had to resettle, they had to relocate to other community areas and other areas. And so the entire community and the traditions, norms, and values they used in order to govern that land was impacted and to some extent also destroyed. And so we wanted to understand the behavior and the activities and impact of the multinational enterprise in these developing economies and what implications that has also on the rural environment. So going away from maybe just thinking that foreign firms entering a country might, bring a lot of these benefits and investments and knowledge spillovers, and we fully agree with these aspects, but we also wanted to see maybe there are also negative implications on multinational enterprises entering environments, and specifically these regional focuses, which we haven't really looked at in an international business context too much yet. And so we consider maybe the more non-economic implications, the more broader impacts of these multinational enterprises. And at the end, we started to question then in this paper the impact of natural resource seeking foreign direct investment in the form of this land acquisitions on the rural population of developing countries. And specifically, we wanted to look at the rural communities and their community informal institutions, so their traditions and norms and values they used for centuries to govern the land. And so from a theoretical perspective, we're also going away from what we've heard so far, which is a heavy focus on institutional logic, Charles and Tim's papers. We go away and look more from an institutional economics perspective. And so specifically new institutional economics, where we have this institutional ecology of formal institutions, like the governmental set rules and regulations, and then also the informal institutions with the common beliefs, traditions, values, and customs. And so we know from that theory as well that the institutional environment of country consists of this equilibrium, that ecology between the formal and informal institutions. However, that theory wasn't giving us enough about that rural environment and the informal institutions of the rural environment. And so we extended, or we used the community informal institutions perspective from Helena Ostrom in understanding or trying to understand how these rural communities, really their long-standing traditions, norms, and customs are impacted by these foreign firms. And so using both theoretical sense in combination, we were able to theoretically identify in the beginning this institutional equilibrium on a rural level of basically the regulations and formal institutions set up by the government and the local governmental institutions, and then also the more informal community, informal institutions set up by the communities, which then set up this rural institutional ecology. And from a perspective, so we're taking, of course, an IB perspective, but we are going away from the solely positive idea of benefits of foreign firms in the economy, and starting maybe, and taking maybe a little bit more of a development economist view, which sometimes maybe a bit more critical and also acknowledges the more negative implications of foreign firms and foreign direct investment in developing economies as a foundation. So, and taking the background and the theories together, we then created a variety of hypotheses that allowed us to identify that impact and then also study. And I'm just going to talk about them very briefly. So the underlying arguments we're bringing forward is, of course, when the community has used that land for subsistence farming, and then the multinational enterprise is coming in and is using that arable land for own international agribusiness farming, the local community can no longer use this land. And that means also the subsistence farming is not longer possible, and the local income is decreasing. And that, of course, it will negatively impact the individual who is part of the community and increases the poverty level of that environment. Now, of course, we could argue that the multinational enterprise brings also job opportunities into the market, but considering that we're talking about the agricultural sector here and the technology which is often used for farming activities, the amount of employees probably is not as high, and the local workers are not qualified enough to get really hired, all of them, by the foreign multinational enterprise. And so they don't really benefit so much from that foreign firm coming into the market, specifically also because most of the produce which is produced is actually globally traded. So they don't necessarily, the local environment doesn't have any benefit that the country might have, but not the local community. And then last but not least, it's not just a local community which is directly impacted by that multinational enterprise take over the land, but also the entire community ecosystem, which is impacted. So the surrounding lands, the water supply, the crop which is used, usually foreign firms bring in international crop, which can destroy the local environment or have been shown to destroy the local soil as well. And so there's overall this really negative impact for the communities. And so we really wanted to understand these negative impacts, and rather than just acknowledging that there is one, we wanted to understand the impact on. Well, we really try to understand why other communities, or what is so important for communities. And so I started to look at what's happening to the community, what happens specifically to these traditions and norms when the foreign firm is coming into the market. And we're going back to this equilibrium discussion, or the ecology, where in a rural environment, we have these formal and informal institutions. And so far, previously to the land acquisition, there was a really dominance of the informal institutional environment by the communities. And now the multinational enterprise is coming in and bringing in their codified rules and regulations, and it's really more codifying the activity. And it also means more strict formal institutions. And so we have a weakening of the communities' traditions and values which they've used to govern the land, and a more stronger formal institutional environment coming in. That's our first hypothesis, basically saying that, yeah, the ecology is shifting towards the more formalized institutional environment, which weakens the communities. And then we wanted to understand, okay, how important are the communities actually for the rural population, and for specifically also the income of each individual community member. And so we looked at the strength of the communities and identified that really the close network of the community members allows them to really profit from that arable land and create income. And that means also the stronger the communities are, the more is the higher the income level, and the less poverty there is in the environment. And so, conclusion, combining the two hypotheses, we then identify that the community is really important to overcome the challenges of the multinational enterprise coming into the land and leading to poverty. But if the community informal institutions are destroyed, then of course, or weakened, better to say, then of course the community can no longer use that land, the community can no longer use their traditions, and that will eventually then lead into rural poverty. And so our concluding argument is, and our concluding finding was that, so as soon as there's land acquisition, there's a negative impact on the rural population, and specifically with regards to rural poverty. So there's an increase in rural poverty. And that is through the mechanism of weakening the community. So through that erosion of the community informal institutions. And so what we think on where we contribute and what we think we need to do in the future in our research field is, so of course we look at the institutional theory perspective from an IB angle, and we contribute that discussion of informal institutions, and specifically also institutional ecology, so that equilibrium of formal of informal institutions in specifically rural environments. And we argue that we need much more research on that. We need to understand better the combination of formal and informal institutions in environments, not just the single focus on formal and not just a single form of informal, but also on both institutional environments. And how developing economies are impacted by these changes of the institutional ecology. But is it purposeful, accidental? Is it a natural progression or not? So we really need to understand much more both institutions in combination. And of course, the informal institution in itself is really difficult to measure, it's really difficult to study. So we need to have much more research on that aspect as well. And then identify also the pressures, national and international pressures on these ecologies, on the institutions. They can come from governments, intergovernmental organizations, so a variety of different pressure factors. Then with regards to IB literature, we look at the community-focused perspective on the rural environment, and we think we need more research on that too. We need to understand better the rural communities, the implications, specifically with natural resource seeking for indirect investment. So there's much more research to be done on that. And of course, we also take this negative perspective on foreign direct investment, and we think that there is more potential to also be a bit more critical on what multinational enterprises do in developing economies. And for that, we also need a perspective of the M&E going and impacting the environment rather than just the other way around, which is a more traditional IB view, which we had so far. And of course, we have implications for policy, and hopefully that the governments and multinational enterprises acknowledge the research and acknowledge also the impact M&Es can have. And with that, I'm stopping here. And thank you so much for allowing us to present this paper. I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Kristin. I think you talk for all of us. What a lovely set of papers, and really asking some important questions. So I think one of the first questions really go to Charles and to Tim, which is about institutional logics. Institutional logics is, for some reason, has not been embraced in international business research. I imagine. But why not? And what were the challenges and what were the gains as you grappled with institutional logics? So I don't know which one of the two of you would like to go first. Charles, you
Sure.
go.
I can jump in. Yeah, it is interesting. As Kristin was presenting, I was thinking about kind of my own entree into institutions was also in institutional economics, and those kinds of approaches just weren't helping to explain what was going on in our context. There was just much more dynamism and change than I think some of the more kind of either institutional economics or especially neo-institutional approaches could explain. And so just kind of for me, just kind of talking to people, and someone said, "Hey, this might be an institutional logic story." And I said, "What's that?" And that led me into this literature. That I think one of the biggest challenges, it's a great question, is the fact, at least from my perspective, that even though there has been more incorporation of it into the IB literature, a lot of it isn't fundamentally considering these types of differences between, say, a firm's home and host country environments. So like I mentioned briefly in my presentation, it focuses on institutional conflict, but it's more the idea of, let's say you're a doctor and you have your own kind of set of values. You work at a hospital that maybe has its own perspectives and norms and values, and you belong to this particular religion that has different norms and values too, and you try to figure out a way to resolve those conflicts. This is more of an actor coming from one set of institutions going to another, facing conflicts. How do you deal with that? And so I think, to me, that was one of the biggest challenges was it's a little bit different shift in mindset. And I think one of the, or at least to me, maybe one of the reasons too why it hasn't gotten as much traction is that it's also harder to measure. We took a qualitative approach intentionally. I think it would be really hard quantitatively to try and capture some of these differences in institutional logics. So that's why I think it's encouraging that I think there has been much greater acceptance of qualitative work, because I think that does open up a lot of avenues for different perspectives on institutions, including institutional logics perspectives that would have been difficult before.
Tim, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just picking up really from what Charles was saying, it is something that's actually quite difficult to study, and we found that the qualitative approach lends itself quite well. I think one of the things is that you're looking at the means and ends, and often when you talk to people, you realize these are things that are very implicit. People aren't even really aware that they adhere to any kind of logic. And I think we found that teasing that out was quite challenging. But I do think in the multinational environment, there's a lot of room for the logics and competing logics in particular, because I think often that helps us understand as a lens the differences that we've looked at before in broader terms by looking at things such as let's say national culture. I think competing logics help focus a lot of this down into a way that makes a lot more sense. But when the question first came in, what I was actually thinking was, of course, when you're looking at superstition, it's kind of like it's slightly difficult to talk about logic in the context of superstition, because if you look at some definitions of superstition, it defines it as being illogical. So yeah, it's quite paradoxical, but nonetheless, it is connecting means to ends one way and another, whether it's through implicit beliefs or assumptions that have been absorbed from a community background or whatever. So yeah, it is something that's difficult to study. And we, as I said at the end, I think what is also quite interesting is a longitudinal approach to looking at how different logics interplay and shape each other over time. And in a way, that's touching base with something that Kristin was saying towards the end of her presentation, even about formal and informal and how they interact. I think that's quite an interesting way to use logic's approach as well for the future.
Thank you so much, Tim. There was a question about country of origin of the multinationals. The question had also occurred to me as I was reading all three of your papers. Did you see that any of the multinationals were, in terms of country of origin, more sensitive to local needs, less likely to incur this damage, more likely to respond in a wise way? I know Fabian Fontanier has done some work about country of origin of multinationals. Did you see anything like that? Obviously, with qualitative research, it's a bit, you know, you don't have a massive N, but Kristin, did you find anything like that in your work?
So we did look a little bit at the country of origin, but what we found is that a lot of these companies are also from other emerging markets or developing economies. So it wasn't as obvious. So the differences weren't as obvious as we thought they might be. And you know, you could argue that maybe other multinational enterprises from other developing economies might understand the local context a little bit better. But we didn't really identify any of these contexts making any differences. And so from our context, that's unfortunately nothing we could really contribute to discussing. So what we did, we also identified maybe local acquisitions, so from Ethiopia or from the local environment, and that research or that didn't result any significant results. So we really focused only on the multinational enterprises, and we didn't unfortunately find any differences between developed or developing country impacts.
Okay, I must admit, as a South African, and South Africa has a big mining industry, I was nervous about to what extent the South African mining firms were behaving in wider Africa. So Charles, can you just briefly tell me, was I right to be nervous? I mean, that's what Kristin says. Kristin says that the emerging market multinationals are not necessarily the ones who enter other emerging markets with the necessary wisdom and care.
You know, in our particular study, in this one here, we just had Western firms. I was trying to remember if we had South African mining firms in the sample or not. But I know in our other studies, we have noticed a significant country of origin effect. And we have, in general, seen that firms from developed countries are more likely to see the environment as something that happens to them. And tend to see it a little bit more in black and white terms of, okay, you either go along with this or you don't. Whereas firms from other developing countries, and I think South Africa probably would fit here too. I'm thinking primarily of some of the firms that are coming from from Asian countries. So China has a big presence in East Africa, for example, and we certainly find that the firms from China are much more likely to take, say, an entrepreneurial approach to treating the environment as more negotiated rather than fixed. So South African firms, yeah, I think so. Yeah, it depended on the firm, but yeah.
You know, you're being so diplomatic. Maybe we should stop while you're still ahead of the game.
South Africa's doing great.
So, Kristin, if I can go back to you, there are lots of questions around development and multinationals, economic development. I think it's perhaps useful to think about development also more broadly. Charles, in your paper, it's such a beautiful quote: issues surrounding unemployment, poverty, and disenfranchisement are not only economic issues. So I think it's about the general question of development. Do you have any comments in terms of either the study of multinationals or some of the issues? Somebody mentioned in the chat box, it seems that multinationals are better able to contribute when there's greater parity in power between them and the host country. But we know from all the literature on spillovers and FDI-enabled development that this is where we hope that can make a difference. So what's your take on that?
For me, yeah, I think that, you know, that's part of what was so frustrating, I think.
Can I cut you off and ask Kristin to answer that?
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you said my name. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry, what I thought you particularly mentioned it.
Oh, sorry, I do have this way of, so it's just the issue around economic development or social development. I think Charles's paper made that very lovely point, that it's not only economic issues, even something like unemployment or so. But I think when we talk about development and FDI assisted development, they're huge issues. So what would be your suggestion in terms of how do we make sure that FDI development realizes more of its potential, or that we as IB scholars are more aware of the pitfalls?
Yeah, that is a very good question, Helena. So I think that what the problem for us was, and what we think is maybe not done enough in the IB field is, yes, there are benefits for foreign firms entering the market and improving and advancing the development level of these economies, but there is also, if we're looking deeper into really the more rural or the more community level, or even probably also the more really down to the individual's impact, there might be negative implications. And I do think that the governments are usually taking the more broader country perspective and the benefits and income of funds into the economy, and really not understanding necessarily the implications for the individual person in the economy, for the individual, in our case, community, for the economy. And so we were hoping that by outlining maybe the impacts on rural communities, that there might be an understanding that there needs to be somewhat of a protective approach, or some micro approach to the community as well, which helps to alleviate some of the negative implications of these foreign firms coming into the market and taking over land and destroying the communities around them. And so what we were hoping is really to outline and start the conversation. I think this is the starting of the conversation. I think there needs to be more done in order to actually make noise and say, we need more on that. We need to acknowledge that there is also the negative impact on these activities. And so we really started to kind of push the boundary here and say yes, and we push the boundaries with the reviewers for sure. There is also this negative implications and on the community and the small individual level, and that the governments and also multinational enterprises, they need to understand that, and they need to find a way how to maybe counteract and these negative implications. We bring some of these possible ways in the paper as well. We talk about polycentric governance, which means that you have a more local and more unit-dependent governance system set up by the government so that they can respond to these more local community implications in a much more quick and flexible way. So we address these issues and possible ways how government can change and policymakers can counteract and maybe help and the communities as well. But essentially what we need to is have more research on the fact that there is negative implications, on maybe communities, on rural areas, on communities also in urban areas. So it's not just in rural, but there could also be in urban implications. And just understand that, yes, knowledge spillovers and investments, and that's all great and positive, but we need to go more detail. And that maybe the rural community focus or the rural aspect, the individual aspect is a way how to do that. Look maybe at that negative implications.
I think it's very interesting. As a community, we had JIBs for a very long time before we had the Journal of International Business Policy. And I think, as your paper so clearly shows, there's a need for policy framework within which multinationals operate. Tim, there's a lovely question about your data gathering. I'm working on a paper on religion, and I was quite sorry for myself because it's hard to convince reviewers that religion is real and factual. And then I saw your paper on superstition come out, and I realized that I had nothing to be worried about. You were seeing religion as the more factual and the less non-logical part of your data. How did you go about convincing reviewers during the review process that you are a scholar who is building on a scholarly tradition and making a contribution to scholarship, and that you have not gone all native? You'll need to unmute.
Actually, in my machine, I'm still getting used to it. Yeah. One of the things that one of the reviewers in particular was very strong on, they were looking at the perspective of formal versus informal institution. And what we argued is, in the case of Myanmar, there was a difference between superstition on the one hand as the informal institution, and the religion, which is Theravada Buddhism in Myanmar, as being the formal. And that is one of the things that we were pushed hard to justify. And I didn't have time to say it in the presentation, but one of the reasons that Myanmar was quite a good context was because Theravada Buddhism in Myanmar is relatively doctrinal, with a lot of rules and regulations about what you can and can't do, and what's legitimate belief and what's not legitimate belief. And it made it relatively, it made it possible, it wasn't easy, but it made it possible to actually distinguish that then from what constitutes superstition, at least from the perspectives of those formal enforcers. But then the difficulty was, in reality, there's a lot of overlap between, I mean, actually in Myanmar, the superstition is not only frowned upon by Theravada Buddhism, it's actually prohibited by state law, but that doesn't stop, superstition wheedling its way in, including with what's going on now in various guises. So the reviewers really focused on that. It's like you're arguing that religion is the formal institution and superstition is the informal institution. You need to be very clear as to what the dividing line is, and how and what that dividing line is made up of. Fortunately, there was literature to support the 227, I think it's called the Patimokkha rules for the conduct of monks. But we were also in a situation where superstition was practiced by, if not monks, then people who were dressed as monks, and we had to use the phrase rogue monks to separate them, and they are people who can be sanctioned and thrown out of the community of monks for such behavior. So it was, to get back to your original point, it was not easy at all to do this, certainly, but they came at it from the institutional perspective, as opposed to religion is all about supernatural beliefs, and so it doesn't belong in a scientific discourse, etc. But yeah.
Sorry, I was mute. Any advice to a scholar trying to achieve a similar kind of paper? I mean, what do you recommend that's not about dealing with this particular reviewer, but about a general strategy at the outset?
for writing a paper about religion. I mean, it was, we were very fortunate. I think one thing that was absolutely key in Myanmar, I mean, it's not my country, but we were lucky to have a co-author who was she is very strongly very knowledgeable about religion, and had some very good connections with, for example, senior monks and rectors. And I think it would not have been possible at all without that sort of credibility, I suppose, of what you're doing. You really needed to have these people with a lot of institutional support behind them, and respect for what they said and their knowledge. Again, going to doctrinal texts about the religion concerned. Yeah, it wasn't, I mean, our focus was superstition. The religion kind of came in later, but it was not easy at all. For superstition, we were lucky in that, not in IB, but certainly in management and organization studies more generally, there are a couple of papers by Professor Eric Zhang we found were very, very helpful and inspirational, that somebody had actually looked at a topic like superstition and managed to get it into a credible journal. So that also, I think, was our inspiration. And we looked at what had been done there with regard to superstitious practice in Asia. But you know, my advice would still be to go ahead and do it, but certainly get yourself some credible sources and some formal literature to back up, yeah, what you're trying to do.
Charles, I don't think it happens often that a paper on Africa where you hang around in rural areas is one of the less unusual papers. So what would be your advice on this topic, in terms of how do you make sure, in terms of the collecting and the reporting of evidence, that you get through to an audience who doesn't necessarily know that much of the context?
That's a good question, and you know, my answer echoes Tim's to a large degree. I mean, I do this work with. I wish my co-author had been able to be here today. He's got a class he needs to teach, but it's that teamwork between Aloysius and I. Aloysius is from Tanzania, studied in Kenya, and then did his graduate work in Ireland, and lives in Canada now. So I mean, he understands. I think you need to have kind of perspective from different places to be able to really understand, you know, the truth of what's going on. And for me, as someone born and raised in the West, but I've lived in Asia, it's kind of one of those where you're able to, I think, see things a little bit differently. And Aloysius and I see things differently from each other. And I think that helps us make a stronger paper. Because I know, you know, thinking about the question about the challenges of publishing this kind of work, you know, I was thinking about the review process for this paper. And one of the biggest things that the reviewers pushed us on, which I was glad that they did, was to be very clear, you know, and not just kind of talk about different institutional logics in kind of a hand-waving fashion, but to be very clear about, okay, so what on this dimension are the firms thinking about versus the local communities? What on this dimension are, and so on and so forth. And so that really forced us to really clearly articulate the differences. And then that gave us an opportunity to tie that back to theory, which I think is the other key to gaining acceptance. Is not just saying, okay, you've got an interesting story to tell or an interesting context. So, okay, how does this contribute to our understanding of IB theory and practice? I think making that connection is really critical between an interesting context and then an interesting theoretical contribution.
Thanks. And Kristin, I'd like to ask a method question of you guys as well. I mean, we often have qualitative research of these fabulously rich settings, and we uncover some fascinating patterns and scary patterns, and then we don't know how bad are the South African multinationals really, or whatever is a generalizable sort of conclusion that we can come to. And when I read your paper, I a number of cases almost took in a breath, and I thought, wow, are you measuring it this way? I mean, your measure of community strength a lot of my colleagues are Black professionals, and they are responsible for paying for multiple family members' education and hospitals, and it's often a burden, and you frame it as a strength, and it took me a while before I'm like, I guess they pay it because they feel a sense of obligation. But how did you go about crafting and convincing the reviewers of defensible mechanisms through which measures that you could use to really get at these informal institutions?
Another good question, Helena. And I'm so happy about my author team, because I think this was a collaborative effort of all of us, specifically Elizabeth Moore as well, and the reviewers, because we had a lot of discussion about these measures, and considering that, you know, informal institutions in generally are very difficult to measure, and there's been lots of discussion about it. And this is a paper for a special issue on informal institutions. So we really needed to, so to say, nail that informal institutions measure. And we struggled a lot to really understand how can we claim an impact on informal institutions in this context, in our context with the communities. But then that measure on community networks and the ties of communities and contribution of individuals to the community environment really allowed us to at least somewhat start a measure on community strength, and allowed us really to understand in rural environments that individuals' community contribution to the community is very different than in maybe non-rural environments, urban environments. And also there's a distinction between what we in the more developed economies consider as a contribution to the community, and as you said, perceived to be maybe more negative, but then versus what's happening in the rural environment. And so we really try to kind of find this measure and allows us to identify that the close-knit network these communities are. I don't know if I'm really answering your question, Helena, right now, and tell me if I don't. But what we really tried is to argue and kind of think about how can we identify the importance of each individual community member. And each individual community member also holds these traditions and norms and values, and knows about the land and what kind of crop is supposed to be planted in January, or what kind of, when are you harvesting, and like all of these traditions which are really dependent on these ecologies, on that specific kind of environment, on that agricultural land. And so the only really possible measure we could find was that individual's contribution to the community. And that was kind of our way of identifying the community strength and the traditional, the agreement of each individual to contribute to the community and to the overall kind of benefit of the environment. But it was not easy to convince everyone in that process that this is a reliable measure as well for us to do so. And as I said before, I think this took 4 rounds of discussion with really great reviewers as well, which could help us in the development. So, I mean, the method section has completely changed over the course of the review process. So yeah, that it kind of allowed us though to come up with that research. And I think what was really great for us as well to support these arguments was to find the land matrix initiative, and that initiative allowed us to identify the land acquisitions and for what purpose the land was used prior to the foreign firm acquiring the land. So we understood what the communities, did they agree upon the land acquisition? How did they use the land prior to the land being acquired from the foreign firm? So the land matrix initiatives data really allowed us also to get much more information about the communities who were negatively affected by that land acquisition. So they kind of supported our argument of the community.
Right.
But it wasn't easy.
I don't think any of these papers were easy. I don't think any papers are easy, but I have a bias that studying an under-research context is particularly hard, because one often has to develop the methodological tools. I think of the very first people who used pattern data analysis. Once upon a time, it was novel and weird. Now we know what it means. Klaus, I see you've made an appearance again.
Yes, if I show up in the webinar, that usually means time is up, which is a pity because I've just looked at the Q&A. There are lots of other questions that are worth discussing. So I encourage the speakers to have a look and engage with offline with the relevant authors. But I do have one question. Tim, I don't want to let you go before saying something about the contemporary situation in Myanmar. You're sitting in Chiang Mai, which is pretty close to the action. Do you have any insights of what the current situation is in Myanmar, and especially how businesses, foreign businesses, react in this situation of what effectively is a military coup? You're still muted.
I keep doing it. Yeah, that is actually an extremely good question. Also quite a delicate question as well. I think going back to what I was saying earlier on about this pragmatic trade-off, it's difficult to know with much certainty what is actually going on, because you hear different stories coming out from different people. But what I can say right now is that obviously there's hardly, it depends who you listen to, but my impression is there isn't much going on right now in the way of business activity. That's the first thing, because of the bank situation and this, that, and the other. A lot of Western multinationals who are there are therefore closed down temporarily by default. So it's almost like they don't have to make a major decision about whether they should withdraw completely from Myanmar. There are a lot of they're either freezing temporarily what they're doing, they're closing down. There's a little bit of an issue because, of course, there was a silent protest, I think it was last week, where if you close down, that was a show of support for the CPRH, the CDM movement, and where malls shut down, everybody inside shuts down by default. But if you decide to shut down alone, then you may find yourself having visits from various authorities. Another point would be, I think, that there are a number of major multinationals there who have signed, I don't know quite whether it's just a declaration or a statement, and it's to do with the Center for Responsible Business in Myanmar. And there are a few names on there that are slightly eye-opening, but yeah, okay, signing forms is signing forms. But some companies have got pressure from their own governments to withdraw. They're having other pressures coming in from other stakeholders, including investment funds, who are either freezing funds or basically saying in so many words that we want to divest and withdraw. So that's just, I suppose, a snapshot of what is quite a complicated, delicate situation, one in which it's quite difficult to actually know for sure what the motivation is of the companies involved. And as a final point, it does depend a lot on the local partner of the company concerned, because obviously you can choose partners who are excellent in terms of distribution networks and getting you access and overcoming bureaucratic hurdles, but you may well find that they are very good at that because they have certain connections that maybe become problematic a little further down the road. As somebody said, I was reading the other day, somebody was warning these companies, don't allow yourselves to be on the wrong side of history. It's a very tough call, I think, but I think we're all horrified with what is going on.
Okay, thank you, Tim, for attempting to answer that question. It's certainly, as we have a lot of other disruptions in the global economy as well, interesting to study this particular disruption, how companies deal with a disruption where you have increasing tension between what the local political leaders want you to do and what the society in your home country or your customers want you to do. So the whole question of what is responsible practice is interpreted differently from different stakeholders, and that puts companies in a very difficult situation. I should really go back to my 2014 paper, which was on mine, and see whether we can update that now. It seems to be suddenly highly relevant again. So again, thank you everybody for your presentations and for the lively discussions, also to the audience for asking all the questions. I think one point I want to get across is this whole area of the interface between business and development is an area that the Academy of International Business and the journals are interested in. So if you do research in this area, do send it to our journals, basically, okay? And looking forward, we are working on a few further seminars that will probably take place in May. Among other, we're going to talk about UN Social Development Goals, where JIBP had a special issue recently. And then we're working on topics like multicultural people and also migration and international entrepreneurship. So watch our social media posts for announcements of the future seminars. Again, thank you very much, everyone, and see you again in May.